Good evening, I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight, turmoil in Russia, the latest on diplomatic retaliation against the West, and fallout from the deadly shopping mall fire. Then on the front lines of cyber warfare, inside the U.S. military's newest combatant command center.
You know, it's not like fighting a war in another domain where you deploy troops, you fight, you go home. Conflict in the cyber domain is constant.
And it's Friday. Mark Shields and David Brooks discuss the latest turnover at the top of the Trump administration and adding a citizenship question to the census. Plus, now read this, the latest entry in the NewsHour bookshelf, a conversation with author Mohsin Hamid on his book, Exit West. All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour. An American soldier has been killed in northern Syria in the military campaign against Islamic State fighters. A British soldier died in the same roadside bomb attack. A local Syrian official says it happened overnight in Manbij, where American troops are aiding anti-ISIS forces. President Trump said yesterday that the 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria will be leaving very soon. But the Pentagon's U.S. Central Command said that it has no information on that. Palestinian protesters confronted Israeli troops along the Gaza border today in the bloodiest day there since 2014. The Palestinians said at least 15 people were killed by Israeli fire. Reuters correspondent Nidal al-Mughrabi witnessed the violence. He spoke with us via Skype a short while ago from Gaza City.
We have seen lots of people, thousands, and several thousands have started to come early to the location east of Gaza along the border with Israel. According to the organizers, people should have stayed 700 meters away from the border. But many of the protesters have ignored the calls of organizers to stay that far. People threw stones. The Israeli army responded by tear gas, live fire, and rubber bullets, as well, and casualties started to fall.
Why is this happening right now? We know that this has been a special day for the Palestinians. What was the immediate impetus?
Every day, every year, it's been some celebrations and some demonstrations to commemorate the day in 1976. And the loss of land. But this day, it was different. Palestinian factions, including the Islamist group Hamas, which controls, Gaza Strip, have supported an idea to mass thousands, and if they could, tens of thousands of people along the border with Israel to demand the right of return.
The Israelis are accusing the Palestinians, accusing Hamas of deliberately sending women and children to the border, putting them at risk, in other words. Did you see that?
The Israelis, since, the morning, they have, said that Hamas was exploiting, the crowds for its own purposes in order to send, civilians to be face to face with Israeli soldiers, along the border. What happened today, we have seen people from all factions, but we have seen lots of people who are frustrated of everything. They are frustrated of the lack of peace. They are frustrated for the lack of any horizon. It has made no difference to them whether they live or die, because the situation in Gaza was so terrible.
It is late at night there. Have things calmed down?
Many, or we can say most of the protesters, returned, home. The Palestinian president has asked for the United Nations to meet over what happened today in Gaza. He condemned it, and he asked the UN Security Council to afford the Palestinians with international protection because of what happened. Tomorrow, there will be a national mourning day and also strike. So that is also another reason for why we could expect more clashes.
Nidal Al-Mughrabi with Reuters, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Christians mark Good Friday across much of the world today, from Jerusalem to the Vatican and elsewhere. Pope Francis began services at St. Peter's Basilica by lying prostrate before the altar. Security was heavy for the occasion. And in the northern Philippines, crowds gathered to witness and record as 7 Roman Catholics were nailed to crosses. The church has tried to discourage the ritual. Back in this country, a jury in Florida has acquitted the widow of the gunman who massacred 49 people at a gay nightclub in Orlando. Noor Salman was found not guilty of lying to the FBI and hiding her husband's extremist beliefs. Omar Mateen was killed by police in the 2016 Pulse nightclub attack. Independent autopsy results raise new questions today about the police killing of Stephon Clark in Sacramento, California. On March 18th, 2 officers fired 20 times at Clark, shouting that he had a gun. It turned out to be a cell phone. Today, Dr. Bennett Omalu, who was a pathologist hired by the family, said that 8 shots hit Clark and 7 of those were from behind. Police had said that he was coming toward them.
The proposition that has been presented that he was assailing the officers, meaning he was facing the officers, is inconsistent with the prevailing forensic evidence.
Dr. Omalu is known for his groundbreaking study of brain injuries in pro football players. That prompted the NFL to adopt new safety rules. More than 24 school districts in Kentucky closed today when hundreds of teachers called in sick. They're protesting a pension overhaul adopted late last night. It says new teachers will not be guaranteed a set benefit amount. This follows a teachers' strike in West Virginia and threats of job actions in several other states. And a Russian hacker accused of attacking Silicon Valley companies is back in the United States to face trial. The Czech Republic extradited Yevgeny Nikulin last night. He's charged with hacking systems at LinkedIn, Dropbox, and other American firms. Still to come on the NewsHour, Russia strikes back, expelling 60 American diplomats from the country. Atlanta, the target of a large-scale cyber attack. Plus, inside the government command center, tasked with fending off hackers, and much more. The diplomatic showdown between Russia and the United States and its Western allies intensified this week following the poisoning earlier this month in England of a former Russian double agent and his daughter. The expulsions of alleged Russian spies by more than 20 nations and the retaliation by Moscow came amid a national tragedy there, last Sunday's deadly fire in Siberia. As Nick Schifrin reports, relations between Russia and the West have reached yet another new low.
Today, Russia tested a new intercontinental ballistic missile it claims can elude U.S. missile defense. But Russia can't elude the current crisis that's made U.S.-Russia relations more dangerous than at any point since the Cold War. Today, American diplomats packed their things outside the U.S. consulate in St. Petersburg. Russia ordered the consulate closed and expelled 60 U.S. officials in response to the U.S. ordering Russia's Seattle consulate closed and expelling 60 Russian officials. These are the most significant expulsions since 1986.
I have just returned from meetings in Iceland with...
But unlike 1986, when President Reagan expelled Soviet diplomats and held talks with the Soviet Union, today the world isn't bipolar, and the two sides have less interest in cooperation. And that makes things more difficult to solve, says Carnegie Moscow director Dmitry Trenin.
For the United States, it is the fundamental Russian behavior that needs to change. For the Russians, however, the goal is a compromise achieved through the normal give-and-take process, and those two views are totally incompatible.
President Putin and I have been discussing various things.
President Trump expresses a desire to improve the relationship, but under the Trump administration, tension has increased. Over the Baltics, NATO jets have shadowed Russian ministers' planes, and Russian jets have rocked their wings to demonstrate they're armed. In Ukraine, the U.S. is sending offensive weapons to soldiers fighting against Russian-backed separatists. And in Syria, U.S. troops have fired on pro-Russian forces who had attacked them. This week, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for the two sides to reduce the risk of escalation.
Time for precautions of this sort, guaranteeing effective communication, guaranteeing capacity to prevent escalation. I do believe that mechanisms of this sort are necessary again.
For Putin, the tension is an opportunity. He's portrayed himself as the only leader strong enough to stand up to a powerful external enemy, but that doesn't mean he can ignore internal crises. Earlier this week, a fire engulfed a shopping center in the Siberian town Kemerovo. This has been a week of funerals and national mourning. 60 people died. At a memorial, a father remembered talking to his daughter on the phone as she tried to escape.
I was crying to my daughter. She said, "Dad, I love you. I'm suffocating. I'm losing consciousness."
The tragedy sparked mourning, but also protests. Residents blame local officials because the mall's exits were blocked and the fire alarm disabled. So Putin visited Kemerovo to pay his respects and present himself as a benevolent leader, launching an investigation. He met with victims' families, letting them interrupt and question him. He portrayed himself as authentic and local officials as corrupt.
100 investigators are working on this case. They will inspect the whole chain of command.
Putin is an accomplished politician who has been very successful over the past 18 years. But a lot of people under him, the bureaucracy, feel that they are only responsible to the Tsar, that they are totally irresponsible and can be totally irresponsible to the population.
Putin's critics accuse him of facilitating the kind of low-level corruption and ineffectual local governance that led to the fire. The fire also shows the limits of Putin's control.
Russia is a combination of top-down control and anarchy. Much of the issues around Russia is not the poor management which exists on behalf of the authorities. It's also lawlessness and lack of responsibility among ordinary people.
Those ordinary people direct their ire at the local government, as Putin portrays himself as confronting local corruption and simultaneously an aggressive West. The U.S. is considering further escalation. Russia maintains blanket denials. Neither side wants war, but it's not clear how they get out of the cycle of confrontation. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schiffer.
The city of Atlanta says it is slowly making progress in restoring its computer networks. Hari Srinivasan explains how 9 days after a cyber attack brought city services there to a virtual standstill, systems are finally coming back online.
Atlanta is among the largest, but only the most recent victim of ransomware attacks, where hackers gain entry to computers, seize files, and lock out users until a ransom is paid. The FBI received more than 2,600 such complaints in 2016. A group known as SamSam is thought to be behind the Atlanta hack. They've already extorted more than $1 million this year from some 30 organizations. The FBI advises not to pay extortion money to hackers, saying it emboldens criminals and does not guarantee that the seized data will be returned. Atlanta officials have not said whether they paid the $51,000 ransom demanded of them. For more on the scope and consequences of these modern-day shakedowns, we turn to Alan Liska, Senior Intelligence Analyst with the security firm Recorded Future. Thanks for joining us. Put this Atlanta hack in perspective for us. How significant is it?
Thank you for having me, Hari. It is actually pretty significant in terms of the scope of the damage. This is, though, one of the things that the SamSam group does as part of their attack structure. A lot of ransomware that we see is broadly distributed, so attackers going after as many targets as possible. The SamSam group is a little bit different. They study their targets, they take their time getting in, and then once they've accessed the network, they make sure that they deploy the ransomware in a way that does the maximum damage possible. And Atlanta is one of the biggest targets that they've hit.
You know, when we think of hackers, oftentimes a stereotype by Hollywood is a teenager sitting in their basement by themselves. But when you talk about groups like this, is this one of the new faces of organized crime?
Absolutely. The SamSam group is well organized. They're well funded. They've carried out attacks since at least December of 2015. They've brought in several $1 million over the last couple of years. So it's, I hate to use the term, but it's a thriving enterprise.
You know, so let's talk a little bit about Atlanta. They've been pretty tight-lipped on exactly what's been affected, but what are the kinds of services, if it's not Atlanta, but other cities are starting to switch from paper to digital that could fall prey to this kind of an attack?
So in Atlanta right now, we see this with their court system being having to switch back to paper and not being able to pay fines, speeding tickets, or access other services. This happens a lot. When you have a group that plans their ransomware attack carefully, they will make sure that it's disruptive. We saw this last year with the attack on the San Francisco BART system, where an attacker got in and installed ransomware on the fare system so that everybody who went to go buy a ticket saw that the systems had been infected with ransomware.
So it seems that, you know, cities and companies put up kind of firewalls to try to keep hackers from getting in kind of directly, but it seems that the human beings inside are the weak links. They get an email, they click on a link, and then all of a sudden the bad guys are inside the network, so to speak.
In this particular case, that's not what happened, but that's the primary distribution of ransomware, is through phishing emails, a fake invoice, a link to a bad website. That is the primary distribution. The good news is that type of ransomware is actually on the decline. So we saw a big drop in that at the end of 2017, and that's continued into 2018. Part of that is organizations are getting better at protecting themselves from that type of ransomware. This type of ransomware is a little bit different because this is targeted, and this is a group that is willing to take weeks or months in order to gain access to the networks they want to get to. That is a much harder, that's a much harder group to protect against.
We see this story because it's the city of Atlanta, but if you just go back and kind of search Google News, you're going to see that the Baltimore Police Department or the fire department here and the Colorado, you know, state by state, city by city, they're experiencing these attacks and they're kind of under the radar.
This is a change in tactic that we've seen over the last year or so. So ransomware used to be, again, widely distributed, widely attacked, but a lot of corporations have stepped up their security and made it much more difficult for these attackers to gain access. However, hospitals, healthcare facilities, government agencies, state and local governments specifically, don't have the resources to fully secure their systems the way some of these other companies, you know, banks and so on do. So they've been more susceptible to these ransomware attacks. They also have oftentimes a mandate to pay the ransom because either constituent services are being disrupted or patient services are being disrupted. So they tend to be more likely to pay. So they're good targets because they will often pay, and they're, I don't want to say easy targets, but because their security teams tend to be stretched thinner, there's more bad guys more likely to find a mistake.
All right, Alan Liska, of Senior Intelligence Analyst at Recorded Future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Stay with us. Coming up on the NewsHour, Mark Shields and David Brooks analyze another Trump cabinet shakeup. Author Mohsin Hamid answers your questions about his newest book, Exit West. And the accountant who got to play in the National Hockey League. But returning to the murky world of cyber attacks and defense, the newest U.S. military command is responsible not for a piece of land or air, but cyberspace. Special correspondent Mike Saray has this exclusive inside view of the men and women protecting the military's digital networks at the United States Cyber Command.
It looks and sounds like every other stateside military base, far from the front lines around the globe. But Fort Meade, Maryland, home base of the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command, the military's newest combatant command, is fighting a war every day. Admiral Mike Rogers commands both the NSA and U.S. Cyber Command.
Today, we face threats that have increased in sophistication, magnitude, intensity, volume, and velocity.
The Internet was largely created by the U.S. Defense Department in the late 60s, primarily for its research and development operations. Now, like every other wired institution, it depends on it for everything it does. As a result, the Defense Department's information network is now targeted by nearly 40 million malicious emails every day. Colonel Paul Kraft's cyber protection teams defend the network from this top-secret operations center called the JSOC.
We do not want the enemy to get a foothold into the Department of Defense's networks, to gain or maintain any terrain just like they would in land.
The NewsHour was granted exclusive access under conditions we not identify team members or the cyber defense technologies they use. Vice Admiral Nancy Norton is the commander of the Joint Forces Headquarters Doden, which is responsible for protecting the military's network.
The National Defense Strategy has made pretty clear that we have near-peer competitors in cyberspace from Russia and China. North Korea and Iran are also routinely working to gain a competitive advantage by getting into our networks.
In addition to these adversaries, U.S. military cyber warriors fight thousands of non-state actors, terrorist groups, and professional hackers, all committed to cracking the firewalls, cyber's first and presumably largest distributed network, now used for everything from combat operations to military health care.
Everything starts with a thing called an indicator of compromise. It could be a malicious spear phishing email, it could be an intrusion, it could be a packet that looks malformed for some reason that doesn't look right, that could do something malicious to our network. The simplest thing is to block it, but if they're in your house, it's about getting that person out of your house and making sure we knew what they touched, and the network is again restored, hardened, and restored to normal.
Once inside, hackers can disrupt a network's operations, like they did last year to the British health system, forcing hospitals to shut down. Or they can steal confidential information, like Equifax's credit reports on more than 145 million Americans. So far, the most serious cybersecurity breaches of U.S. defense and intelligence networks were inside jobs. Army PFC Bradley Manning, who now identifies as Chelsea, copied and released nearly 1 million classified documents.
There is no public evidence.
The leaking of the NSA's surveillance techniques and other classified material by a subcontractor, Edward Snowden. There are also accidental security breaches, like the careless use of a flash drive by a military unit in the Middle East in 2008 that temporarily created an opening into the Defense Department's network. These cyber teams are drawn from all the services and ranks. Some were trained by the military, others were recruited for their cyber skills.
You know, it's not like fighting a war in another domain where you deploy troops, you fight, you go home. Conflict in the cyber domain is constant.
I can shut down your power grids. I can paralyze your infrastructure.
A line of code buried in this Army recruiting ad generated nearly 800,000 hacking attempts on a fake military website. The 1% who cracked the site were invited to join the military's cyber warfare team. How many of you would consider yourselves gamers? Training and retaining this new generation of cyber warriors is an ongoing challenge.
I could walk out today and get a very easily six-figure salary. It's not about the money. It's about the pride in your job and what you do for the American people.
The challenge we have isn't recruiting. The challenge is retention.
Lieutenant General Vincent Stewart is a deputy commander with U.S. Cyber Command.
The metaphor I like to use in this space, it's like playing hockey. You're constantly on the move in both offense and defense, and it's fast-paced, it's hectic, and one goal can change the outcome.
General Stewart can't elaborate on Cybercom's offensive tactics, like those recently used to try to disrupt ISIS's online recruiting and media operation, or what, if any, involvement the U.S. had with the widely reported but officially denied cyber attack on an Iranian nuclear facility using a software virus called Stuxnet, which disabled critical equipment.
What was created with Stuxnet was not just an operation to sabotage Iranian nuclear research. It was a new kind of weapon.
Peter Singer with the New America Foundation and other defense analysts believe the Iranian attack to be a major turning point in cyber warfare.
They created a weapon, something that caused physical damage, but it was unlike every other in history in that it was computer software, as much as zeros and ones.
But it is a more recent cyber attack on the 2016 presidential election that is now the concern. Detecting, let alone stopping the Russian meddling wasn't Cyber Command's job, since it was largely executed on Facebook and other public social media networks the military is prohibited from intervening with.
Do you want the intelligence community to work within the civilian sector?
Do you think the civilian elements of this space have the capacity to defend themselves at the level you can defend?
Yes.
You think they can?
Yes.
So they don't need your help?
This is an issue of priority. This is an issue of some resources, but it's an issue of focus.
That's actually what has clouded the debate over 2016, is you have these intelligence agencies seeing things coming in, seeing things hit American political institutions, but of course, they're not supposed to be involved in American political questions. And then on top of it, it throws them into a partisan debate. And that's why it's been so difficult.
The Senate Armed Services Committee recently challenged Cyber Command's Admiral Mike Rogers on the U.S. response to the Russian interference.
Essentially, we have not taken on the Russians yet.
It's probably fair to say that we have not opted to engage in some of the same behaviors that we are seeing.
And this is not just about the Chinese, this is about the Russians, this is about the Iranians. These are all our potential adversaries who understand the things that underpin Western liberal democracies and are going after it. That's what keeps me awake.
In the cyber realm, an attack can dismantle infrastructure and networks. It can also destroy faith in institutions. For the PBS NewsHour, Mike Saray reporting from Fort Meade, Maryland.
It was the third week in a row where President Trump fired a member of his administration. This week, it was David Shulkin of the Department of Veterans Affairs. That and other news brings us to the analysis of Shields and Brooks, that syndicated columnist Mark Shields and New York Times columnist David Brooks. Gentlemen, more turnover. This time it was the head of the Veterans Affairs Department, David. It looked as if he and the president were getting along well, but then there was a dispute over how fast they should privatize what the what the VA does. And then there were questions about a trip he took to Europe with his wife last week, but he's out.
Yeah, can you imagine working at a place where every week somebody goes, and this was a quiet week, but they still lost a cabinet member. And it just speaks to how little sense of camaraderie and trust there is, because you never know who's going to be there day to day, and no assurance that so-and-so is staying is a real assurance. I guess to me the most interesting thing is the replacement with Rear Admiral Jackson, and that's sort of part of the key belief of populism, which Donald Trump, I guess, stands for, is that experience is more corrupting than it is educational. And that you need clean people from outside who are pure from partisan interest and from rotting in the swamp. And we're about to test that proposition because apparently an extremely good man, but with no administrative ability, is being asked to run the second largest bureaucracy in the U.S. government. And as someone who has no administrative ability, but who hangs around people who do, it's just a different style of thought. And I feel great sympathy for that guy coming into what's going to be an extremely difficult job.
And in fact, we read that Dr. Ronnie Jackson, the president's the White House physician, was reluctant, apparently, when this was first raised with him, take over the VA.
That's exactly it. He does come with very high, as David mentioned, personal recommendations. Alyssa Mastranacaco, who was the Deputy Chief of Staff in the Obama White House, called him not only a patriot but a saint. And Dan Pfeiffer, I mean, it went on the record, Obama people did, about, and he'd been there for under 3 presidents. So, I mean, I think the personal credentials are pretty solid. And the president likes him. And he did very well on television presenting the president's medical report and telling with a straight face the president weighed 239 pounds. So that endeared him. But I come back to the firing. And this is quite a unique administration in the terms of public service. I can recall when Donald Trump was running, he said, and I looked it up again today, I know the best people. I know the best managers. I know the best steelmakers. We're going to have the best cabinet. I don't know how many more it's going to take. We're on our 3rd national security advisor at this point. But what really is so bizarre to me is I've been around so long that I can remember when the Peace Corps was created. And there was one young man who put his career on hold. And they said, why are you doing this? He says, I've never done anything that was political or patriotic or unselfish because nobody ever asked me. And he said, President Kennedy asked me. That sense of public service, that it's a high calling, that it's for the common good, is totally absent from this president, from his lexicon, from his frame of reference.
Well, while we're talking about personnel, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, Scott Pruitt, David, appears to be in some hot water this week because it turns out he was living in a room or renting in a room near the Capitol Hill last year and paying an unusually small rent, $50 a night, in an area where it's more expensive than that. And then there's a story in the Washington Post today about unusually inexperienced and not people who didn't do a great job in the White House personnel office. So just more questions.
Yeah, and this goes to the point Mark made and the notion of norms. I've been talking to a lot of people who like the president. The president's approval ratings are up again. He's up to about 42%. And people are saying, I ignore all that tweeting. I just know the economy's doing well. And so I give him credit for that. And there's a validity to that argument. But there's been a damage to the norms by which we govern ourselves, by the capacity of state, the way we think about our government. He appoints people who he's personally liked to, as if we're in a royal system where a personal relationship to the king is all that matters. And then with Pruitt, he takes this apartment which has some ties to the wife of a lobbyist. And it's not that it's the biggest corruption scandal in the history of the Republic. It's just that somebody who goes in with a mentality, I'm here to serve the people, I'm here to serve the country, it just doesn't feel right to do that. Alarm bells going off in your head of any normal person. Oh, that's going to look bad. That's going to hurt my capacity to do my work. And so the fact that the alarm bells suddenly didn't go off suggests to me that the shift in capacity from private sector to public sector has not happened. They haven't crossed the mental leap that Mark described, that you can be corporate lawyer, you can do all that stuff, and it's perfectly fine. But when you do the public service, you're entering a different realm. You're probably not going to get to fly first class, which you were already used to. There's just going to be sacrifices you're going to have to make, but you do it because you feel it's the right thing.
It's a different realm, Mark, and typically the vetting is tough to get these jobs in the administration.
It is, and the piece you mentioned in the Post pointed out that they started with a far smaller pool of talent. Most administrations start with 300,000 names. They had, I think, 1/4 of that when they came in, and many have been shot down because they didn't meet the loyalty test at one point or another. And of course, the whole personnel staffing was absolutely blown up. It was done by Chris Christie. They'd done, according to independent observers, a pretty darn good job, and then they just burned that. So they've been behind. And most administrations, Republican and Democrat, at the Office of Personnel Management, put in professionals. I mean, really talented people. I've known a number of them myself. And, that's because they recognize that personnel is policy in any administration. You can have the greatest ideas and policy in the making, but unless you have able able, committed people to execute those policies, it's for naught. And that's exactly what has been the problem here.
Well, we change of subject, but related in a way because it's administration policy, David, as we learned from the Census Bureau, from the administration, the Trump administration, that what the census folks are going to do in 2020 is add a question about people's citizenship, raising all kinds of questions about whether this is going to be a deterrent to people participating who are living here without all the proper documents.
Yeah, in normal times, frankly, it doesn't strike me as an odd question to ask, are you a citizen? And historically, the census has asked that question. But in the atmosphere of fear that surrounds immigration these days, with ICE behaving as they are, and with the administration really threatening on some occasions to kick citizens out or kick non-citizens out, what you're doing, this comes at the end of that, in that climate. And given that climate, asking this question, making this policy shift now, can only be interpreted as a way to get people not to answer the question. There's important to shift political power because money depends on how many people you're representing at each jurisdiction. Federal money follows those numbers. And if you're scaring people away from participating in the census, then that jurisdiction will get less money. And so given the climate, it strikes me as a menacing question and probably a counterproductive one. I mean, it's already clear that if you have a government person coming to somebody's door and asking a question and a private person, people answer the private person more because there's no fear there. But the government implies force. And so they already get a higher turn down rate. If you then make it even more menacing because they're going to ask this question that could get you thrown out, people are going to close the door.
Of course, the government, Mark, or what the government is saying, Mark, the administration is saying they think they're going to get a more accurate count. But I guess the skeptics are saying no, they're going to hide.
Well, you put me down on the side of the skeptics because there's 132 government programs based on need, and so you have to get whether it's food stamps or whatever it might be, school lunches that are based. The apportionment to the states is based upon the need. And if the poorer people, the less affluent people, who oftentimes are those who are recent immigrants to this country, are silenced out of timidity, fear, and we don't give an accurate count, that means people who need it most are not going to get it, are going to be deprived. It's going to mean less political power to states like California, but ironically probably to a state like Texas too, if it's enforced. I mean, because they're the large Latino population. But it's just the motives the hands are not clean coming to this question. It didn't something that came up out of a think tank. It was announced by Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, who you don't think had spent a PhD's research on looking at this. That it did have a certain appeal to the president in the White House.
Different subject, the event that really took over Washington last Saturday, and that was the big March for Our Lives, David, led by those young people at Parkland High School, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Are we seeing, it was a huge turnout around the country. Is this something that's going to last? What's your sense of it? Is it going to make a difference in the argument over gun control?
I'm still skeptical it'll make a difference, frankly. I think they have not done a good job of winning over anybody who's already blocked gun legislation in the past. But it was instructive to me. I went to watch and I went to be with the marchers as a journalistic observer, of course. And it struck me as a very moderate march. Mm-hmm. It was focused on the issues, specific issues of banning assault weapons, a few specific moderate pieces of legislation. And I was greatly heartened by it, frankly, because sometimes it seems like the extreme on this side feeds the extreme on this side, and our entire political system is gyrating without any sense of moderation. But this was a moderate march, and the people were good-hearted. There was a good spirit. There was no culture war fighting. There was no radicalization. It struck me as democracy the way it's supposed to work. And then I followed the feedback on the march on Twitter, frankly, and it's like I was at the different march. It's as if they were all radicals, and one set of radicals was shouting at another. So it was revelatory to me that the world you see on Twitter is not the real world, and that there are a lot of decent people who have positions, this or that, you can agree with or not, but it gave me a much more hopeful sense about our democracy, frankly.
It says something about social media. Mark, about
It does
30
say, I
seconds.
think it does say an awful lot about social media. Judy, no arrests here in Washington. Very little refuse left behind. They were a clean, respectful group of people. And I think David's absolutely right. The goodwill, good nature was pervasive. There weren't taunts or any really hostile activity. And I am more hopeful, quite frankly, having lived through it and seen it, and that there may be some hope. I mean, that they've sustained it, they've kept it going. I do think that the NRA national headquarters is very much on the defensive right now, and gun sales are down. You may have noticed, which is Remington went into Chapter 11 this week after 202 years.
We will watch it. Congress was away. They're coming back. Maybe we'll get a sense next week.
We will.
Mark Shields, David Brooks, happy Passover, happy Easter to both of you.
Thank you.
Now, a work of fiction explores migration, violence, love, and fear. Jeffrey Brown sits down with the author of our March pick for Now Read This, our monthly book club. It's a partnership with the New York Times.
Two young people fall in love in an unnamed city in the Muslim world, and as violence takes hold, they're forced to flee, joining a mass migration that's become one of the hallmarks and most contentious events of our time. But this is a novel, Exit West, that uses realism and some magic to capture life for millions today and a possible future. As we do every month, we've asked you to send in questions, and author Mohsin Hamid is here to answer as many as we can fit in. Mohsin, nice to see you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. I'll get right to it. There were a lot of people who wondered, it's a little unusual to get right to this, but a lot of people wondered about how this matched up with you, right? So Elaine from Fayetteville, Arkansas, is any part of this novel drawn from your own experience? Another question, are your main characters based on real people you know?
Well, I've been migrating my whole life. So in a way, I suppose I was always going to write at some point a novel about migration. I moved to California when I was 3, and then back to America when I was 18 from Pakistan, London, now back to Pakistan. So the experiences of migration and the emotional pain and confusion that comes from it, I think, do in a way come from me. But at the same time, the horrors that say they're not the experience are things that I'm not familiar with, but are a bit like nightmares for me. Living in Pakistan, it's something that one is terrified could happen, as opposed to what has been happening.
You chose, a lot of people noticed that the not giving, well, they're the names of the two characters, but not other characters, right? Some places are named, but not the city where they're from. So Christina Pike from Cherry Valley, California. Was Mr. Hamid trying to give this story a timeless universal quality by not giving a specific location to the city?
A bit. It's a good question. I think that for me, the nameless city partly was because I didn't want to name it Lahore, where I live, because something terrible happens to that city. Yeah. And it would have broken my heart to do it to my own city. But partly I wanted the reader to be able to imagine it as their city, or the city of their father or mother or their best friend.
And Jill from Connecticut, Bob Olson in Minnesota. What is the thought behind giving only the two protagonists names in the book?
The novel covers a lot of ground. It moves from place to place, different characters come into it. And having only two named characters just, I think, keeps the reader in touch with the emotional heart of the story, that whoever else you meet, they matter. But it's really these two, this couple, that the book's all about.
They move, others move, and this was the magic I was referring to. For those who have not read the book, people move through open doors. Explain that, because obviously that interested our readers.
So in the novel, these black doors begin to appear, black rectangles where doors used to be. So maybe you're in your apartment and the door to your bathroom has been replaced by this black rectangle. And if you push through it, you're no longer in DC or wherever you live. You're somewhere halfway around the world, like Tokyo or Bangkok. And suddenly in the novel, billions of people begin to move and the whole world starts to change.
And so a lot of people asked about that device, And I was interested, conversely, some people, Connor from St. Louis said, how and why did you decide not to write anything about the couple's physical journey out of the country?
Well, because I think what's happened is we have become so focused on the story of how somebody crosses the border. You know, how did you cross the Mediterranean in a small boat? Or how did you cross the US-Mexico border, crawl underneath the barbed wire? And we think that people who've done that are different from us. It makes us imagine that that's all their life consisted of, and that's very different from us. But once you take away that part of their story, you are left with people who are just like us, actually, that any of us can have this experience. And so hopefully taking away that part of the story doesn't minimize the importance in the real world that happens, but reminds us that that's not what makes these people who they are. They are people just like us.
But if you put it into a kind of magic setting, that opens up a whole other issue, doesn't it? Because then we wonder who are they, what's going on, how does this even happen?
Well, I think that what's happening is technology works a bit like magic. So right now, most of us have a little black rectangle in our pocket or our backpack or our purse. And when we look at it, our consciousness goes far, far away from our bodies, like magically appearing somewhere else. You're looking at your phone, and suddenly you're reading about the moon or Mars or Antarctica. And I thought, what would happen if your body could move as easily as your mind can move? I think technology is obliterating geographic distance, and so the doors, in a way, give life to that.
There was a question I was quite interested in because it kind of goes to your thinking about how you write. I've seen Exit West described as a fairy tale. I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, but the language in the book does have, to me, this reader, striking style that reminds me of someone telling a story. I felt like a listener in some ways rather than a reader.
I'm really happy to hear that. I mean, I write by reading myself out loud again and again. I think that
You walk around the room talking to yourself,
I mean,
reading?
if you were to see me from a distance, you'd think that I was crazy, just this guy pacing around in his study talking to himself. But yeah, I'm reading constantly. I read 2 hours out loud for every 1 hour I write. But I think the reason why that matters is because we imagine we read with our eyes, but we actually process words and language through circuitry in our minds connected to our ears.
And there was a lot of people wondering, I'm not going to give away the ending for everybody, but a lot of people wondering about where this leaves you. Are you optimistic about the situation, the refugee situation?
I'm optimistic about our species. You know, we are descended from refugees, all of us. Our people have migrated. Everybody comes from the mother continent of Africa, and our people have moved on since then. So I think that we will find a way. Human beings do. And the current fear that we have of the future, I suspect we'll overcome it.
All right, we're going to continue our talk, and we'll have that entire conversation available online. For now, first let me say thank you, Mohsin Hamid, for joining us. And let me tell you at home all about our pick for April as we turn back to nonfiction. The next book is The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. It's an epic and wonderfully told story of history, science, and reportage about the largest source of fresh water in the world and the threat to America's waterways. Prize-winning author Dan Egan will join us for online extras all month and then answer your questions right here at the end of April. So remember, you can join Now Read This on Facebook and through the NewsHour site. We're at 51,000 readers and counting in the book club, and most importantly, everybody's reading along. Join us. Thanks.
Now to our NewsHour share, something that caught our eye. The video of a rescued chimpanzee's flight to wildlife sanctuary recently spread like wildfire on the internet. The NewsHour's Julia Griffin tracked down the video's pilot and asked about his mission to save Africa's imperiled primates.
It's a simple video that tugs at the heartstrings. A baby chimp bonds with, sleeps on, and even learns from the man flying him to a safer home. The pilot is Anthony Carré, a Belgian aviator working for Virunga National Park in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Since I was a little boy, I had two big wishes, and I was flying small planes and animals. And when I had the opportunity to work for Virunga National Park, I grabbed it with 2 hands.
On a normal day, Carré is an eye in the sky, assisting rangers in anti-poaching patrols, wildlife censuses, and other duties. But a few times a year, he ferries orphaned apes and monkeys 400 miles north to Lero Primate Rehabilitation Center. His passenger this time was Musa, a 3-year-old chimpanzee recently rescued from poachers.
It's actually a very sad story because they took that little chimp away from his family. They killed his family.
Poachers often sell slaughtered adult monkeys as bushmeat in local markets, but they prefer to peddle the baby animals as pets. Once confiscated from their captors, Lero provides primates like Musa a safe space to recover. The organization cares for more than 6 dozen chimps and nearly 100 monkeys, many of which arrive malnourished, stressed, and physically wounded from tight ropes and small cages. Which is why, Kare says, most baby primates are not restrained during his flights.
If you have like a really chill little baby chimp who is happy to be on your lap and it holds you, then you have the wrong effect when you put it in a cage. Then it will totally freak out, start to cry, and it can die actually. So we take the time to gain his trust, to feed him, and when he feels comfortable and he jumps in your arms and he holds you, then it's the time to do the flight.
And while he is happy his video went viral, Kare emphasizes this flight should never have happened in the first place.
I hope the people not only say, okay, it's a cute movie, but the message is that that little chimp should be with his mom and not on my lap.
Musa is now in quarantine with other rescued baby chimps. When he is ready, he will be introduced to a new chimp family. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Julia Griffin.
And it restores your faith in people. And a news update before we go. One Baton Rouge, Louisiana police officer has been fired over a 2016 fatal shooting of a black man. Alton Sterling was killed in a struggle outside of a convenience store. The second officer involved was suspended for 3 days. Earlier this week, the state declined to bring criminal charges against the white officers. And that is tomorrow night on PBS NewsHour Weekend. No, you won't see it on PBS NewsHour Weekend, but that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Have a great Easter and Passover weekend. Thank you and good night.
You're watching PBS.